The alarm on Captain Sarah Mitchell's hotel room phone buzzed at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was scheduled to. She had been awake for the past hour, staring at the ceiling of her modest Athenian hotel room, watching the darkness gradually give way to the pale blue of dawn. Sleep had been elusive, not because of anxiety or nervousness. Sarah had flown nearly 25,000 hours across 3 decades of her career without a single major incident, but because of something she couldn't quite articulate. It was a feeling, a vibration in her bones that pilots either developed or they didn't. Some called it intuition. Others called it the result of 1,000 small observations processed by the subconscious mind. Sarah simply called it her gift. She sat up slowly, her 52-year-old body protesting with the stiffness that came from sleeping awkwardly. The morning light cast long shadows across the modest furniture of her hotel room. She padded across the cool tile floor to the small window and gazed out at Athens awakening below her. The city was already warm, the Mediterranean sun rising with the intensity that only August could bring. Greeks would be seeking shade by midday. Tourists would seek air conditioning, and Sarah would be 37,000 feet above it all, navigating her Boeing 747 across the Atlantic toward New York. She showered under water that was still slightly cool, letting it wake her senses fully. The spray felt good against her skin, invigorating and clarifying. Sarah had learned long ago that the best pilots were those who respected the machine but never feared it. Fear clouded judgment. Respect kept you alive. As the water cascaded over her, she found herself doing what she always did before a major flight, running through scenarios in her mind. What if the hydraulics failed? What if an engine shut down at critical altitude? What if weather turned unexpectedly severe? A good pilot didn't prepare for danger by being paranoid. She prepared by mentally rehearsing every possible emergency response. By 5:45 a.m., Sarah was dressed in her captain's uniform. Navy blue with gold insignia on the shoulders and wings of solid gold pinned to her chest, symbols of authority and competence earned through 2 decades of uncompromising dedication. She stood before the mirror, running a brush through her shoulder-length blonde hair, now streaked with silver that she refused to dye. That silver represented experience, respect, and hard-won knowledge. She pulled it back into a tight bun, the style she'd worn since her first commercial flight in 1994. Her blue eyes reflected back at her, steady, clear, intelligent. Those eyes had seen dozens of countries, hundreds of weather systems, thousands of sunrises from the flight deck of an aircraft. The elevator descended to the lobby, where she collected her pre-ordered coffee and a light breakfast from the hotel cafe. The other pilots and crew members were already gathering, most looking somewhat tired but professional. Sarah recognized most of them, familiar faces from routine runs. First Officer James Chen was there, a brilliant young pilot with 12 years of experience and a natural gift for navigation. Flight Engineer David Morrison was checking his briefing papers, his weathered face showing the wear of a man who'd been working in aircraft for 41 years. These were her crew, and Sarah trusted them completely. At Athens International Airport, the massive Boeing 747 gleamed in the early morning light like a silver whale caught on the tarmac. The aircraft was a marvel of engineering, 370 tons of aluminum, engines, fuel systems, and advanced avionics. This particular aircraft, registration N47BA, had been flying for 17 years without significant incident. Sarah had piloted it 7 times before, and each time she respected it more. The 747 was an old workhorse in aviation years, but it was reliable, powerful, and magnificent. Today it would carry 398 passengers and 20 crew members, 418 souls in total, on a 14-hour transatlantic journey. As Sarah walked across the tarmac toward the aircraft, her flight case in one hand and her pre-flight materials in the other, she took a moment to observe the ground crew bustling around the aircraft. They were refueling, conducting exterior inspections, loading cargo, and preparing for departure. The 747 would be carrying 160 tons of jet fuel, necessary for the long distance to New York, but also creating an enormous potential energy burden. In her mind, Sarah processed this information automatically. 160 tons of fuel meant the aircraft would be near maximum weight at takeoff. It meant less margin for error, requiring more runway, creating more forces during acceleration. It was manageable, certainly. She'd done it hundreds of times, but it was information worth noting. In the pre-flight meeting, Sarah briefed her crew on weather conditions, flight plan, passenger manifest, and emergency procedures. Everything seemed routine. The weather forecast showed clear skies most of the way, with some turbulence expected over the Atlantic around hour 9. Nothing unusual, nothing concerning. Yet that inexplicable feeling persisted in the back of Sarah's mind, a small voice that had saved her career more than once. "Everyone understand the flight plan?" Sarah asked, her voice commanding but not harsh. Her crew nodded. She stood up, buttoning her jacket. "Thank you all for your professionalism. Let's make sure every single person on this flight gets home safely." As she walked toward the aircraft herself, Sarah found herself thinking of her daughter Emma, away at college studying engineering. Emma had wanted to be a pilot once, inspired by watching her mother navigate the skis. But Sarah had quietly discouraged it, protecting her child from the countless sacrifices the profession demanded. That decision had always sat uncomfortably with Sarah, wondering if she was teaching Emma courage or fear. She climbed the stairs to the 747, her hand touching the fuselage as she always did, a small ritual of respect. The aircraft felt solid, powerful, ready. The interior smelled of fresh upholstery and jet fuel. Sarah made her way to the flight deck, where James was already running preliminary checks. She settled into the captain's seat, a position she'd earned through years of perfect flying records, continuous training, and unwavering commitment to safety. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment and whispered a quiet prayer, something she did before every flight. Her mother had raised her with faith, and Sarah had never abandoned it despite the modern world's increasing skepticism. She asked for clear skis, safe passage, and protection for all aboard. It was 1:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, she would request pushback from the gate. In 23 minutes, they would be rolling down the runway. And at 2:00 p.m. exactly, something would happen that would test every fiber of her being and prove whether a lifetime of preparation, intuition, and courage could overcome the impossible. The flight deck of a Boeing 747 is a place of controlled chaos where thousands of systems work in perfect synchronization. Every switch, every gauge, every digital readout represents critical functions that keep 370 tons of aircraft and human cargo safely in the sky. At 1:47 p.m., Sarah sat in the captain's seat, running through the pre-takeoff checklist with methodical precision. James called out each item, his voice calm and professional. Landing gear down and locked. Flight control surfaces free and correct. Hydraulic pressures normal. Fuel quantity confirmed. The routine was familiar, almost meditative in its predictability. The ground crew had finished their preparations. The boarding bridge had been retracted. All 398 passengers were now seated, their luggage stowed, their seatbelts fastened. Sarah could imagine them in the cabin behind her, tourists returning home, business people heading to meetings, families excited to see loved ones. They had no idea that in just minutes they would face the most terrifying moment of their lives. That was the privilege and burden of command. Sarah carried the weight of their safety in her hands. "Pushback in 2 minutes," James said, receiving confirmation from ground control. Sarah nodded, her hands moving through the pre-takeoff procedures with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times. She adjusted the flight control trim, set the flap position to 5 degrees, and confirmed that all navigation systems were locked on the Athens routing. The aircraft felt solid beneath her, ready, powerful. She could feel the raw energy contained within the engines, millions of horsepower ready to be unleashed. The push dug connected to the nose gear with a gentle nudge, and the 747 began its slow, ponderous backward roll away from the gate. Ground crew signaled with their flashlights. The airport terminals slipped away behind them. Sarah monitored the movement with precision, ensuring the massive aircraft didn't clip any equipment or other planes. The 747 was enormous, and while she had excellent sightlines, the sheer scale of the machine meant one moment's inattention could result in a catastrophic mishap before they even reached the runway. "Flight control check," Sarah announced, and James executed the standard movements: aileron roll left, aileron roll right, elevator pitch up, elevator pitch down, rudder left, rudder right. The aircraft responded perfectly, each control surface moving with hydraulic precision. Everything was nominal. Everything was ready. The radio crackled. "Olympic 411, cleared to taxi to runway 21 left." "Roger, cleared to taxi runway 21 left," James repeated, confirming the clearance. Sarah advanced the throttles slightly, and the 747 began its forward journey across the Athens airport taxiway. The wheels rumbled beneath them. The engines hummed with building power. Sarah could hear the distinctive sounds of each engine, that unique symphony that indicated full functionality. Her ears were trained to detect even the slightest irregularity in engine sound, and right now, all four Pratt & Whitney turbofans were singing in perfect harmony. The runway appeared before them, stretching nearly 4 kilometers into the distance. It was long, wide, and perfect for their heavy departure. Sarah positioned the aircraft on the center line, aligned with the runway markings that painted a white stripe down the center. Behind her, she could sense the anticipation of 398 passengers, though most were probably already absorbed in airline magazines, conversations with seatmates, or music from their headphones. They had no idea what was coming. "Pre-takeoff checklist complete," James confirmed. Sarah took a deep breath. This moment, the moment before takeoff, was one she never took for granted. The transition from ground to sky was where physics had its final word. No matter how much training, how much experience, how much preparation, once the aircraft began rolling, they were committed. The runway would be consumed meter by meter. At some point, rotation would occur, the nose would come up, and they would climb into the sky. "Good afternoon, Athens Tower. Olympic Airways 411 is ready for departure. Runway 21 left," Sarah transmitted, her voice calm and professional. "Olympic 411, you're cleared for takeoff. Runway 21 left. Winds 230 at 8 knots." Sarah pushed the throttles forward smoothly, increasing engine power. The 747 responded immediately, its massive bulk beginning to accelerate down the runway. The acceleration was gentle at first, then increasingly powerful. Sarah monitored the airspeed indicator as it climbed from 0, 80 knots, 100 knots, 120 knots. The engines roared with barely contained fury, the entire aircraft vibrating with the power of 4 massive turbofans driving it faster and faster. 140 knots, James called out, monitoring the acceleration. "Airspeed is good." Passengers pressed back into their seats, some watching the runway disappear beneath the wings as they accelerated. The ground blurred. The aircraft was committed now, traveling at speeds where stopping was no longer possible. They were in the realm of physics where an aircraft either flew or crashed. There was no middle ground. Sarah's eyes scanned the instruments in a continuous rhythm: airspeed, altitude, engine temperatures, engine pressures, hydraulic pressures, fuel flow. Everything was normal. Everything was perfect. 160 knots. V1 speed, James announced. V1, the decision speed. The point past which an engine failure during takeoff would not result in an abort attempt. They were going to fly. "Rotate," Sarah commanded, beginning the smooth backward pressure on the yoke that would bring the nose up and transition the aircraft from ground effect to flight. The nose of the 747 lifted gracefully. The main landing gear left the tarmac. Passengers who had been watching the runway suddenly found themselves looking at sky. In a few seconds, they would break through the layer of low-level turbulence and climb into smooth air above Athens. But it was in that exact moment, the moment of rotation, when the aircraft was most vulnerable, when the landing gear was leaving the Earth, but the aircraft had not yet achieved significant altitude, that everything changed. A deep, catastrophic boom erupted from the right side of the aircraft. It wasn't the sound of thunder. It wasn't the sound of any normal aviation event. It was the sound of metal tearing itself apart at high velocity. The number 3 engine, the rightmost engine, had catastrophically failed. But this was no gentle engine shutdown. This was an explosion. Debris rocketed out of the engine casing at thousands of miles per hour, shredding metal, destroying components, transforming one of the world's most reliable engines into a useless, smoking pile of twisted metal. The entire aircraft lurched violently to the right. Alarms screamed to life in the cockpit, a symphony of electronic warnings. Red warning lights blazed across the instrument panel, transforming it into a disco of danger. The aircraft, which had been climbing smoothly into the sky, suddenly began losing altitude. The remaining 3 engines couldn't overcome the massive power imbalance. The 747 was trying to roll right, trying to tip, trying to follow the failed engine toward the ground. Sarah's hands gripped the yoke with fierce intensity. Every ounce of strength went into fighting the aircraft's tendency to roll. Around her, warning lights continued to flash. The hydraulic pressure gauges showed concerning drops. The aircraft continued to lose altitude. They were at 500 feet now, 450 feet, dropping back toward the city they had just begun to escape. "We have a problem," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding her. But in her mind, a single, crystalline thought was forming. They were not going to make it if she followed the rules. The moment stretched into eternity. Sarah's hands fought the yoke with every ounce of strength her body possessed. The aircraft wanted to roll right, wanted to plummet, wanted to obey the laws of physics that now worked against them. The 747 was descending through 400 feet, dropping toward the very city they had just lifted off from. Below them was residential Athens, apartment buildings, office complexes, streets filled with cars and people who had no idea that a crippled aircraft was falling toward them. "Engine 3 is gone," David Morrison screamed from the flight engineer's station behind them. His voice cracked with the strain of the emergency. "Complete failure. I'm losing hydraulic pressure on the right side." Sarah's mind was already working 3 steps ahead. This was what separated the extraordinary pilots from the merely competent. In moments of catastrophic crisis, the human brain could process information at superhuman speeds if it was trained to do so. Sarah had spent 3 decades programming her mind for exactly this scenario. Her eyes scanned the engine readouts even as her hands fought to keep the aircraft stable. "James, retract the landing gear," Sarah commanded, her voice ice cold. The landing gear had been deployed for takeoff, extended to absorb the shock of takeoff rotation. According to every manual, every training protocol, every regulation in the Boeing 747 operations manual, the first action after an engine failure during rotation was to retract the landing gear. Landing gear created massive drag, and at this critical moment of low altitude and low airspeed, that drag could be the difference between living and dying. James's hand moved toward the gear retraction switch. He was an excellent pilot, trained to follow protocol, conditioned by years of simulator training to trust the manuals and procedures. But something in Sarah's voice stopped him. "Wait," Sarah said sharply, "don't retract." James's hand froze. He looked at his captain with confusion. "Captain." Sarah's mind was racing through calculations that a computer would have struggled to process. The 747 weighed 370 tons. The aircraft was currently carrying 160 tons of fuel, maximum capacity for the transatlantic crossing. The remaining 3 engines were still developing power, but they were struggling. With the landing gear down, They created massive drag that was absolutely necessary for landing but was catastrophic for climbing at low speed. If she retracted the landing gear now, the aircraft would indeed have less drag and more aerodynamic efficiency. In normal circumstances, this would be the correct decision. But these were not normal circumstances. With 3 engines and one completely destroyed, with a massive power imbalance, with the aircraft already descending through 350 feet, and the tops of Athens's buildings visible through the windscreen, Sarah realized something that no simulator had ever taught. They didn't have enough power to both climb and retract the landing gear. That was the impossible truth they faced. The aircraft simply couldn't do both simultaneously. If she retracted the gear, the aircraft might gain some efficiency, but the momentary loss of lift associated with gear retraction combined with the power deficit would force them lower, not higher. They would lose altitude, fall into the dense residential area of Athens, and everyone aboard would die. But if she kept the gear down, if she accepted the drag penalty and flew low, very low, at dangerously slow speeds, she might be able to maintain altitude long enough to clear the city and reach an airport. It was insane. It was against every rule in the book. It violated fundamental aeronautical principles that pilots were drilled on from their first day of training. It was also the only option. "Captain," James said again, his voice tight with tension, "the manual says to retract landing gear immediately after engine failure. Boeing recommends." "I know what Boeing recommends," Sarah cut him off, not unkindly. Her eyes remained locked on the instruments and the view ahead of them. The right wing was heavy, fighting against her desperate attempts to keep it level. But Boeing never tested this scenario with this much fuel and this much power loss. The computer simulations assume a certain power level. We don't have that power level. David leaned forward from the flight engineer's station. "Captain, if we don't retract the gear, we're going to be flying below minimum design specifications. The aircraft isn't rated for sustained flight at this configuration." "I'm aware of that, David," Sarah said, her voice carrying a steely certainty. "But being below minimum design specifications is better than being dead. I need 3 things right now. First, I need you to secure that failed engine completely. Shut it down, shut off its fuel, shut off its hydraulics. That power imbalance is killing us. Second, I need maximum power on the 3 remaining engines, everything they've got. And third, I need you to monitor those hydraulic pressures constantly. When we lose hydraulic pressure, we lose flight control. That's our Rubicon." David's face was pale, but he immediately began working with furious intensity. His decades of experience told him that his captain was making an insane decision. But they were 35,000 pounds of damaged aircraft with 400 people aboard, descending toward a city of millions, and insane decisions made by brilliant pilots sometimes saved lives. "James, keep the landing gear down. Stay right with me on the yoke. We're going to fly this aircraft lower than it's ever been designed to fly. We're going to use ground effect, the aerodynamic lift created by flying close to the surface, to stay airborne. We're going to fly at speeds that would normally stall this aircraft, but the ground effect will keep us flying." James swallowed hard. He understood what Sarah was saying. Ground effect was a real aerodynamic phenomenon, but relying on it for sustained flight was theoretical, dangerous, and absolutely unprecedented. The aircraft would be operating in a flight regime that no simulator had ever trained for, because no pilot had ever survived attempting it before. "I'm with you, Captain," James said quietly, committing himself to this insane course of action with absolute faith. The aircraft descended through 300 feet. Sarah could see individual buildings now, could see people on the streets below looking up in shock and terror. The 747 was flying far, far lower than any aircraft should fly in an urban area, but Sarah's hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her mind had compartmentalized the fear and the impossibility into small boxes that she could manage. "David, status of the engines," Sarah commanded. "Engine 3 completely secured. Engines 1, 2, and 4 responding to throttle input. Hydraulic pressure stable on the port side, but I'm seeing concerning drops on the starboard side. Captain, I estimate we have maybe 10 minutes before we lose meaningful hydraulic control on that side. 10 minutes. Across those 10 minutes, they had to clear the densely populated neighborhoods of Athens, climb high enough to clear the mountains that ringed the city, and somehow, impossibly, make it to an airport. Sarah's jaw clenched as she realized the magnitude of what she had just committed them to. But there was no turning back now. She had made the choice. She had broken the rules, and now she would have to live with the consequences or die with them. "Hold on," Sarah said softly to her crew. "We're going low." Landscape below them transformed from runway to city in a heartbeat. What had been tarmac became streets, buildings, people. Athens sprawled beneath them in all its concrete glory, a metropolis of millions utterly unprepared for what was about to happen. Sarah kept the aircraft at precisely 250 feet, a height that would have been considered dangerously low even for military aircraft, let alone a commercial jumbo jet carrying 418 people and 160 tons of fuel. But this wasn't a choice anymore. This was survival. The 747's massive wings stretched across 68 meters of space. As they flew lower, those wings began to experience ground effect, an aerodynamic phenomenon that pilots spoke about in training but rarely relied upon for actual survival. The air beneath the wings, unable to escape downward because of the Earth's surface, had to move horizontally instead, creating an additional cushion of lift that would normally require significantly more airspeed. In theory, ground effect could allow the aircraft to maintain altitude at speeds 20 to 30% below normal stalling speeds. In practice, no one had ever tried it in a fully loaded, heavily damaged Boeing 747. Sarah was about to make history. "I have Athens Tower," James said, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke into the radio. "Olympic 411 declaring emergency. We have complete engine failure on number 3, operating on 3 engines, maintaining 250 feet, requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing at Hellinikon." The response from the tower was delayed, as if the controller couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Olympic 411, say again your altitude." 250 feet, tower. "We have critical power situation and cannot climb. Emergency landing requested immediately." Silence. Then, "Olympic 411, we are clearing all traffic. You are cleared to land runway 21 left on your current approach. Emergency services are being dispatched to the airport." That was good. That was very good. But they still had to get there. And between them and the airport lay the dense residential neighborhoods of Athens, Calydha, Nice, Myene, Daphne. Millions of people in apartment buildings, schools, offices, with a crippled 370-ton aircraft about to pass directly overhead at a height where a seagull would barely be able to clear it. Sarah banked the aircraft gently left, beginning the turn toward the airport. The 747 responded sluggishly, the damaged hydraulics on the starboard side creating asymmetrical control. Every movement had to be careful, measured, precise. She couldn't afford sharp turns or aggressive maneuvers. This massive aircraft needed to be flown like a wounded bird, delicate despite its bulk. "Speed," Sarah commanded. 160 miles per hour, James reported. "We're at the minimum safe speed for this aircraft at normal weight. Below this, we'll stall, but with ground effect." "Ground effect is holding us up," Sarah confirmed. "Stay with me." Below them, Athens unfolded like a tapestry of human life. Sarah could see individual cars on the streets. She could see people on balconies. She could see laundry hanging from clotheslines. The aircraft was so low that the rooftop seemed to rush past them at impossible speed. The sound was deafening, 4 massive engines screaming at near maximum power, creating a noise that probably sounded like a bomb to anyone below who heard it. David's voice crackled over the intercom from the flight engineer's station. "Captain, number 4 engine is showing temperature rise. I'm having to manage power carefully. We're at the absolute edge of what these engines can sustain." Sarah's mind calculated everything in real time. The engines were approaching critical temperatures because they were operating at maximum power, trying to overcome the massive power deficit created by the failed engine and the drag of the deployed landing gear. Every second they had to maintain altitude was another second pushing those engines toward failure. But there was no choice. This was commitment. This was flying on the edge of every physical and aeronautical law. They swept over the first residential neighborhood. Sarah could see people pointing up at them, could imagine their shock and terror. A passenger aircraft didn't fly this low over cities. This was wrong. This was impossible. This was the kind of moment that would dominate news cycles for weeks to come. But Sarah wasn't thinking about news cycles. She was thinking about physics. She was thinking about aerodynamic principles. She was thinking about the exact angle of bank needed to navigate around buildings. She was thinking about wind shear and turbulence created by the urban landscape. She was thinking about the fragile dance between maintaining altitude and avoiding obstacles. "Building at 2 o'clock, James called out, his voice tight. Sarah's hands adjusted the yoke slightly, banking the wing just enough to clear a high-rise office building. They passed so close that passengers could see people inside the offices looking up, in absolute shock. The windows of the aircraft offered a bird's-eye view of regular people going about their regular days, completely unaware that one of the world's largest aircraft had just screamed past their windows at treetop height. The airspeed gauge was hovering just above the stall warning. Sarah was flying at 160 miles per hour, slow enough that a car on the highway below them was going faster. But the ground effect was working. The aerodynamic phenomenon that physics professors discussed in lectures was keeping this massive aircraft airborne through pure scientific principle. The earth beneath them was their ally, pushing up, helping them float, refusing to let them fall. "Hydraulic pressure on the starboard side is dropping," David reported, his voice urgent. "Down to 60%. I'm losing it, Captain." Sarah's jaw tightened. They were down to the wire now. 10 minutes had been David's estimate, and they must have used up most of it by now. As the hydraulic pressure decreased, her ability to control the aircraft would diminish. The aircraft would become increasingly difficult to maneuver, increasingly sluggish in its response to her inputs. But they were clearing the neighborhoods. The dense residential area was beginning to thin out. Ahead, she could see the industrial area around the airport. They were close. So close. "Airport is 12 kilometers ahead," James said. "We can make it, Captain, we can make it." But Sarah wasn't celebrating. She was seeing what was between them and that airport. She was seeing the hills that ringed Athens. She was seeing Mount Aigaleo, rising 600 meters above the city, directly in their path. And she was seeing a Boeing 747 that was losing hydraulic power, flying at stall speed, dependent on ground effect to stay airborne. And she was realizing that ground effect would disappear the moment they had to climb. The moment they had to gain altitude to clear the mountain, the earth would be behind them. The aerodynamic cushion would vanish. The aircraft would be relying purely on 3 engines and 160 miles per hour of airspeed to do something that every aeronautical principle said was impossible. Sarah's hands remained steady on the yoke. Her breathing remained controlled. Her mind continued to work through the problem even as the obstacle loomed ahead. "Mount Aigaleo at 10 kilometers, James said. "Captain, we need to climb." Sarah looked at the mountain. She looked at the aircraft's instruments. She looked at the hydraulic pressure that was dropping with each passing second. And then she looked at the landscape ahead, searching for something, anything, that might give them a chance. And then she saw it. High-voltage power lines. 2 sets of them, running parallel to each other, threading through the terrain like a gateway between the city and the hills beyond. It was insane. It was against every rule of aviation, but then again, so was everything else they were doing. "James, I'm going between those power lines," Sarah said quietly. Mount Aigaleo rose before them like a sentinel guarding the passage between Athens and the rest of Greece. Sarah could see every detail of it now: the rocky slopes, the sparse vegetation, the ancient stone that had stood sentinel over this land for millennia. The mountain climbed to 600 meters above sea level, which meant it rose approximately 350 meters above their current flight altitude of 250 feet. In normal circumstances, climbing 350 meters would be trivial. The 747 could climb thousands of meters in a matter of minutes. But these were not normal circumstances. "Mount Aigaleo is in our direct path," James said, his voice carrying the strain of someone stating the obvious that was also stating the impossible. "Captain, we need altitude we don't have." Sarah's mind was already calculating. The aircraft was losing altitude gradually, not rapidly, but steadily. The three engines were struggling to maintain this altitude with the massive drag of the deployed landing gear and the damaged hydraulics. They had maybe 30 seconds before the natural descent of the aircraft would become undeniable. In 30 seconds, they would either clear the mountain or they wouldn't. "I see it," Sarah said quietly. Her eyes were scanning the terrain, looking for the route that had caught her attention. There, yes, still visible, the high-voltage transmission lines, 2 sets of them running parallel, threading through the landscape like a corridor cut through the mountains. The lines were elevated on massive steel towers, running at roughly the same altitude as their current flight path, maybe slightly higher. Between them was a passage, a canyon of empty air that offered a theoretical route around the mountain. Theoretical was the operative word. "David, I need maximum power. Everything these three engines have. I don't care about temperature limits. I don't care about safety margins. I need power now," Sarah commanded. "Captain, if I push these engines any further—" "Do it," Sarah cut him off. "That's an order." Behind them, David Morrison, a man with 41 years of experience in aircraft engineering, did something he had never done before. He pushed 3 massive Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines past their normal operating limits, toward temperatures and pressures that could cause catastrophic failure. But he did it because his captain had asked. And in that moment, Sarah's judgment was the only thing standing between 418 people and death. The aircraft shuddered as the engines suddenly surged. The airspeed indicator began to tick upward, 165 miles per hour, 168, 170. Altitude began to stabilize. The aircraft's descent slowed, then halted. They weren't gaining altitude, but they had stopped losing it. "Hydraulic pressure," Sarah demanded. "Down to 40% on the starboard side," David reported. "We're losing it fast, maybe 5 minutes before we lose meaningful control." 5 minutes? They didn't need 5 minutes. They needed 30 seconds. 30 seconds to navigate between those power lines and clear Mount Aigaleo. Sarah began a gentle bank to the left, positioning the 747 to approach the power line corridor. The aircraft responded sluggishly. The damaged hydraulics were making themselves known now. Every control input required more deliberate pressure, more exaggerated movement. It was like trying to steer a massive ship that had lost most of its rudder. The power lines were visible now, 2 sets of massive steel cables suspended between towers that rose like sentinels from the Greek landscape. Sarah could see the insulators, the hardware, the incredible industrial complexity of the electrical transmission system. She could also see how close those lines were to each other. The aircraft's wingspan was 68 meters. The gap between the 2 sets of power lines was perhaps 75 meters at the widest point. In theory, they could fit through. In practice, they had to thread that needle perfectly. A drift of even a few meters in either direction would result in a wing hitting power lines, which would mean electrocution, fire, catastrophic structural failure, and death. "James, I'm going between those power lines," Sarah stated. Not asked, stated. Get me all the data you can on that approach. Wind conditions, terrain features, anything that might affect our flight path. James worked furiously at the navigation console. Wind is from the west at 15 knots, which will push us slightly to the left. Terrain below the power lines drops into a valley. If we miss... We won't miss, Sarah said, though even she didn't believe those words. But belief was irrelevant now. They were committed. Sarah adjusted her approach vector, angling the massive aircraft toward the power line corridor. Below them, the terrain was changing, the dense urban landscape of Athens giving way to more rural areas, to olive groves and small villages. This was still populated area, still full of people who had no idea what was happening above them. The power lines grew larger, more defined. Sarah could see the exact spacing between them now, could calculate the margins with terrifying precision. The approach needed to be perfectly level. Any pitch up or pitch down would cost them altitude they couldn't afford to lose. Any roll would bring a wingtip dangerously close to the lines. 100 meters to the corridor, James called out. Altitude holding at 250 feet, speed 172 miles per hour. The towers supporting the power lines flashed past, massive steel structures that seemed impossibly high. Sarah's hands made micro-adjustments to the yoke, keeping the aircraft perfectly centered on the invisible corridor between the two sets of lines. Her entire world had collapsed to this single, impossible task. Nothing else existed. No thoughts of the passengers, no thoughts of the crew, no thoughts of the news that would follow. Just the aircraft, the corridor, and the physics of keeping a damaged 747 on a precise flight path. 50 meters, James whispered. The power lines seemed to reach down toward them. Sarah could see the individual cables now, could see the geometry of their suspension. The aircraft was perfectly aligned. The descent was controlled. The speed was stable. 25 meters. They were past the first set of power lines. The starboard wing passed by the lines with maybe 10 meters of clearance, a distance that would have been terrifying in any other context, but felt like a canyon in this moment. Sarah adjusted the aircraft's path slightly, aiming for the precise center between the two sets of lines. 10 meters, James said, his voice barely audible. The aircraft slipped between the power lines like a ghost. Sarah felt the moment of passage as if it were physical, a sensation of relief and terror combined. The wingtips seemed to miss the cables by inches, though her instruments told her it was more like 5 or 6 meters. But in her perception, time slowed, distance compressed, and the margin of error felt infinitesimal. Then they were through. The power lines receded behind them. Mount Egilio lay to their right, no longer a direct obstacle but a massive peak they had somehow managed to circumnavigate. Clear, James cried out, a note of triumph and disbelief in his voice. Captain, we cleared it. Sarah's hands released the yoke slightly, allowing herself just a moment to breathe. Sweat was running down her face. Her muscles ached from the incredible tension of maintaining perfect control. But they were alive. They had done something that every rule in the book said was impossible. Altitude, Sarah asked, her voice steady even as her body trembled with adrenaline. 230 feet and stable, David reported. But Captain, hydraulic pressure is down to 20%. We're losing it. The systems on the right side are about to become completely unreliable. Sarah nodded grimly. They had cleared the mountain, but the aircraft was failing in real time. They had purchased time with that incredible maneuver, but time was still running out. Ahead of them, somewhere in the haze of the afternoon, the airport waited. Set course for Heleniken, Sarah commanded. Maximum speed. Let's get this bird on the ground before she falls apart. Airport appeared through the haze like a mirage, a concrete promise of salvation that still felt impossibly far away. Sarah could see the runway stretching before them, a long, wide ribbon of asphalt that seemed to beckon them toward safety. But between where they were and where they needed to be lay a distance that felt both infinite and terrifyingly short. They were still at 230 feet altitude, traveling at 175 miles per hour, with an aircraft that was actively deteriorating around them. "Distance to runway?" Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. 8 kilometers, James replied. "We can make it, Captain. We can definitely make it." But Sarah wasn't thinking about making it. She was thinking about what would happen when they touched down. A normal landing procedure called for a gentle descent, a carefully calculated approach that would bring the aircraft to the runway at a precise angle and speed. The 747 would touch down on the main landing gear, the nose gear would lower gently, and the aircraft would decelerate gradually using reversers and brakes. They weren't going to have any of that. With hydraulic pressure down to 20% and dropping, Sarah knew that the flight control systems were reaching the point of complete failure. The aircraft was becoming increasingly sluggish in its response to her inputs. Turns were taking longer. Pitch changes required more deliberate movements. The aerodynamic characteristics were changing as the aircraft's systems failed. "David, status of those hydraulics," Sarah commanded. "Down to 18%. Captain, I'm seeing pressure fluctuations now. The systems are starting to fail intermittently. We might lose pitch control at any second." Pitch control. The ability to move the nose up or down. Without it, they would be unable to flare for landing, to pull the nose up at the last moment to slow their descent. Without flare, they would come in nose first, would hit the runway like a bomb. The impact would destroy the aircraft, kill everyone aboard, and potentially trigger a massive explosion given the 160 tons of fuel still in the tanks. Sarah's mind raced through the mathematics of disaster. The aircraft was descending at approximately 400 feet per minute, a moderate descent rate. But as they got lower, that descent rate would become critical. At 200 feet, she would need to begin the flare, beginning a gentle pull-up to reduce the descent rate to something survivable. The standard flare would reduce their descent rate from 400 feet per minute to perhaps 100 feet per minute at touchdown. But if the hydraulics failed during flare, they would crash at 300 feet per minute. The impact would be unsurvivable. "I'm going to need unconventional landing procedures," Sarah said quietly. "James, I want you to begin transmitting emergency status to the tower. Tell them we're coming in hot. Tell them to have emergency vehicles standing by. Tell them that we may not be able to execute a standard flare." James's eyes widened slightly, but he immediately began the transmission. "Hellenic Tower, Olympic 411 is inbound for emergency landing. We have complete hydraulic failure imminent. We may be unable to perform standard flare procedures. Request emergency crews to stand by for possible crash situation." The response was quick. "Olympic 411, emergency vehicles are standing by. Runway 21 left is clear of all traffic. You are cleared for immediate landing." Sarah made the decision. It was radical. It violated every principle of gentle aircraft handling that she had learned. But it was survival or death, and there was no middle ground. "David, I'm going to need you to do something extraordinary," Sarah said. "When I give the signal, I want you to use the manual hydraulic pump to inject as much pressure as you can into the flight control systems. I'm going to need a surge of control pressure at the last moment." David understood what she was saying. The manual hydraulic pump was an emergency backup system designed for situations where normal hydraulic pressure was completely lost. It was primitive, inefficient, and could provide only a brief surge of pressure. But in those final seconds of landing, that surge might be enough. "Understood, Captain," David said grimly. The runway grew larger. They were now 6 kilometers away. The aircraft was descending steadily, the descent rate remaining constant because the engines were still developing thrust, was still fighting against gravity. Sarah maintained their current descent profile, not attempting to shallow it or steepen it. She was accepting the physics of the situation, letting the aircraft's weight and the aerodynamics determine their trajectory. 5 kilometers, James called out. Altitude 150 feet. Sarah's hands remained steady on the yoke. Her breathing was controlled. Her mind was in that perfect state of focus where everything extraneous fell away. She could feel the aircraft around her, could sense its deterioration, could perceive the moment when the hydraulic pressure would finally fail completely. 4 kilometers, altitude 120 feet, speed 170 miles per hour. The runway was visible now in all its detail. Sarah could see the runway markings, the approach lights, the emergency vehicles already positioning themselves along the edge. She could see the control tower, see the faces of the controllers who were watching this impossible approach unfold. 2 kilometers, altitude 80 feet. This was the critical moment. In a normal landing, they would have already begun the flare, would already be reducing their descent rate. But Sarah held the aircraft stable, maintaining altitude and descent rate. She was counting on ground effect to keep them airborne. She was counting on the low altitude to prevent the aircraft from dropping too fast. 1 kilometer, altitude 50 feet. The runway was directly ahead now, filling their vision. Sarah could see every detail, every light, every marking, every potential obstacle. The aircraft was descending at 400 feet per minute, which translated to a vertical speed that would result in a very hard landing if not arrested. "Flare now," David shouted. "Captain, the hydraulics are about to fail completely." Sarah's hands pulled back on the yoke with controlled intensity. The aircraft's nose began to rise. The descent rate began to decrease, but the response was sluggish. The hydraulic pressure was almost completely gone. The elevators were barely responding. "Manual pump now," Sarah commanded. David pushed the manual hydraulic pump with desperate intensity. The aircraft suddenly responded. The nose came up more aggressively. The descent rate dropped, 300 feet per minute, 250, 200. They touched down. But they didn't touch down gently. The landing gear made contact with the runway at approximately 150 feet per minute descent rate, 3 times the normal landing descent rate. The impact was violent, catastrophic in its intensity. The main landing gear compressed, absorbing forces that pushed the suspension to its limits. Alarms shrieked throughout the aircraft. The wheels screamed as they made contact with asphalt at 170 miles per hour. But the aircraft stayed on the runway. The gear held. The fuselage remained intact. Sarah's hands moved immediately to the thrust reversers, rotating them to their maximum positions. The engine screamed as their thrust was reversed, creating a violent braking force. The aircraft shuddered and bucked, decelerating rapidly. The nose gear came down with a violent impact as the aircraft's pitch changed. They were skidding down the runway now, the massive aircraft fighting its own inertia, fighting the laws of physics that wanted to continue its forward motion. "Brakes, maximum brakes," Sarah commanded. James engaged the wheel brakes with full pressure. The aircraft's descent rate dropped, 120 miles per hour, 180. The runway was consuming itself beneath them. Sparks flew from the wheels. Smoke rose from the brake assemblies. The aircraft was decelerating at a rate that pushed the structural limits of the landing gear to the edge of failure. 60 miles per hour, 40, 20. The 747 finally came to a sliding, smoking, screaming halt in a cloud of burned rubber and superheated brakes. The engines wound down. The alarms fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of systems failing and cooling, metal contracting, and the overwhelming weight of adrenaline draining from every person aboard. They had made it. Against every law of physics, against every violation of aeronautical protocol, against impossible odds, they had made it. For 7 seconds after the aircraft came to a complete stop, there was absolute silence in the cockpit. The engines had spooled down to idle. The alarms had ceased their mechanical screaming. The emergency warning lights had stopped their desperate flashing. It was a silence so complete, so profound, that it felt almost unnatural after 93 seconds of pure chaos and survival instinct. Sarah's hands were still gripping the yoke. Her fingers were locked in that death grip. Her muscles contracted so intensely that she couldn't immediately release them. Her vision was narrowed, tunnel-focused on the runway ahead of them and the emergency vehicles that were racing toward their position. Her breathing was rapid, shallow, a physical manifestation of the adrenaline still flooding her system. "Captain?" James's voice was small, questioning, as if he wasn't sure whether to speak, whether breaking the silence was appropriate. Sarah took a deep breath, then another. She forced her fingers to release the yoke, forcing her hands to fall to her lap. The trembling started immediately, the involuntary shaking that comes when the body finally acknowledges that it has survived something that should have been unsurvivable. "Everyone okay?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from the strain of the last minutes. "Affirmative," James replied, his voice shaking slightly. We made it, Captain, we actually made it." "Status of the aircraft," Sarah commanded, shifting into the professional mode that had carried her through the emergency. The crisis was over, but there were still protocols to follow, still procedures to execute. David Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom from the flight engineer's station. "All engines shut down, hydraulic systems completely failed, electrical systems still nominal on the primary bus. No fire indication from the failed engine. Captain, I have no words." Emergency vehicles were surrounding them now, their lights flashing in the bright afternoon sun. Fire trucks, ambulances, crash rescue vehicles, all responding to what must have been broadcast as the most serious emergency an airport could face. The 747 sat on the runway, slightly damaged but intact, smoking from the superheated brakes, a monument to something that should have been impossible. "Begin evacuation procedures," Sarah ordered. "Get everyone off this aircraft safely. After we have confirmation that all passengers and crew are accounted for, then we can assess the damage to the aircraft." James reached for the intercom to alert the flight attendants, but he paused. "Captain, do you want to address the passengers first, to explain what happened?" Sarah considered this. The passengers had no idea. Most of them probably still thought that Sarah had been conducting some kind of intentional low-altitude tour, some unusual routing brought on by weather or traffic. They had no comprehension of how close they had come to death. They had no understanding that in the space of 93 seconds, they had experienced the most extraordinary survival moment in modern aviation history. "Later," Sarah said quietly. "First, we make sure everyone is safe, then we talk." The evacuation was orderly but tense. Flight attendants opened the emergency doors. The evacuation slides deployed. Passengers who had been chatting, reading, sleeping, or staring out windows suddenly found themselves moving toward emergency exits, toward slides that would carry them down the side of the aircraft. Some were confused. Some were frightened by the sudden urgency. Some still didn't realize that anything unusual had occurred. Sarah remained in the captain's seat, watching the evacuation on the monitors. She could see passengers sliding down the emergency slides, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern to outright terror, as the reality of the emergency finally penetrated their consciousness. She could see ground personnel in protective gear rushing toward the aircraft, ready for a catastrophe that hadn't occurred. The evacuation took approximately 4 minutes. 418 people descending emergency slides and being led away from the aircraft by ground personnel. Flight attendants did head counts. Crew members checked the cabins. Slowly, miraculously, a final count was confirmed. All 398 passengers, all 20 crew members, everyone accounted for, everyone alive. Only then did Sarah allow herself to leave the flight deck. She unbuckled her seatbelt slowly, as if the simple act of releasing herself from the captain's seat represented releasing herself from the enormous weight of responsibility she had been carrying. She stood, and her legs nearly buckled. The adrenaline crash was hitting her now, waves of exhaustion and reaction washing over her system. James reached out to steady her. "Captain." "I'm okay," Sarah said, though the tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. "Just need a moment." She walked to the windows and looked out at the scene below. The emergency vehicles, the passengers being led away, the ground crew, the fire trucks standing ready. The reality of what she had done was beginning to sink in. She had broken virtually every rule in the Boeing 747 operational manual. She had violated aviation regulations that existed for good reason. She had made decisions that, if they had resulted in catastrophe, would have ended her career in disgrace and possibly resulted in criminal charges. But she had saved 418 lives. Sarah made her way down the flight stairs to the tarmac. The afternoon heat hit her like a physical force, the August sun of Athens beating down with intensity. Emergency personnel converged on her, wanting to help, wanting to assess her condition, wanting to know if she was injured. "I'm fine," Sarah said, waving them off. "Check on the passengers, make sure everyone has been examined. I want medical teams checking for injuries." An airport official approached, his expression one of shock and awe. "Captain Mitchell, that was. I don't have words. You saved this aircraft and everyone aboard. How did you, what were you thinking when you—" "I was thinking about my aircraft and my crew and the 398 people in that cabin," Sarah said simply. "Everything else was secondary." She walked toward the terminals where passengers were being gathered in holding areas. She needed to see them. She needed to speak with them. She needed to help them understand what had happened. As she walked, Sarah saw something that would stay with her forever. A young girl, probably 6 or 7 years old, standing with her mother, pointing back at the aircraft and saying, "Mommy, the airplane went really low. Did the pilot let us see the city?" The mother looked back at the smoking aircraft, at the emergency vehicles, at the obvious signs of crisis. Her face told her that something extraordinary had happened, something far more significant than a sightseeing tour. But she didn't have words to explain it to her daughter. Sarah knelt down to the girl's level. "Yes, sweetheart, the pilot did let you see the city very closely, and because of that, you and everyone on this airplane got to be very, very brave today." The girl smiled, not understanding the gravity of what the pilot was saying, but sensing that something important had occurred. Sarah stood up and continued walking toward the terminals, where hundreds of people would soon be asking questions about what had happened. Some would understand the magnitude of it. Others would take hours or days to comprehend how close they had come to catastrophe. And all of them would eventually come to know the name of the captain who had broken every rule in the book to save their lives. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tarmac. The damaged 747 sat quietly in the background, exhausted and battered but intact. And Captain Sarah Mitchell walked toward her passengers, knowing that the real ordeal, the investigation, the scrutiny, the questions about her rule-breaking decisions, was just beginning. The investigation that followed was unlike anything the Federal Aviation Administration or Boeing had ever conducted. Every decision Sarah made during those 93 seconds was scrutinized, analyzed, and questioned. Aviation safety experts were brought in. Flight engineers pored over maintenance records and aircraft systems data. Accident investigators interviewed every crew member, every passenger, every ground personnel who had witnessed the emergency. The question was simple but profound. Had Captain Sarah Mitchell saved 418 lives, or had she simply delayed an inevitable catastrophe? The answer came from an unexpected source. Boeing's own engineering division conducted a comprehensive analysis of the failed engine, the aircraft's aerodynamic behavior, and the various options available during the emergency. Their conclusion was stark and undeniable. If Sarah had followed protocol, if she had retracted the landing gear, if she had attempted a standard climb-out to gain altitude, the aircraft would have crashed into the dense residential neighborhoods of Athens within seconds. The power deficit, the fuel load, the aircraft's weight distribution, and the failed hydraulic systems created a situation where standard procedures would have resulted in certain death for everyone aboard. But Sarah's decision to keep the landing gear down, to fly low over the city using ground effect, to thread between power lines, and to execute an unconventional landing had achieved something that no simulator, no manual, no training scenario had ever prepared for. She had kept a crippled aircraft airborne long enough to reach a runway. The official investigation report concluded with a statement that would reverberate through the aviation industry for decades. Captain Sarah Mitchell's extraordinary knowledge of aerodynamic principles, combined with her exceptional judgment and willingness to deviate from standard procedures in a situation where standard procedures would have proven fatal, represents the highest form of professional excellence. Her actions saved 418 lives. The day the report was released, Sarah stood before a press conference at the FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Her appearance was poised and professional, but her eyes carried the weight of what she had experienced. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. The world wanted to know, how had she done it? What was she thinking? Wasn't she terrified? "I was trained by some of the finest pilots and instructors in the world," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. "They taught me the rules, the procedures, and the principles of aeronautical science. But they also taught me something more important. They taught me that the rules exist to keep people safe, not to replace human judgment. In a situation where following the rules would have killed everyone, I had to trust my training and my understanding of aviation to find another way. I'm grateful that it worked." A reporter stood up. "Captain Mitchell, do you regret breaking those aviation regulations?" Sarah paused, considering the question carefully. "I regret that I was in a situation where the only way to save lives was to break those regulations. But do I regret my actions? No. I would make the same decisions again because the alternative was the death of 418 people. Some rules are meant to be followed absolutely. Other rules exist as guidelines, and in extraordinary circumstances, judgment must be applied. I hope that my case helps the aviation industry understand the difference." Over the following months and years, Sarah's story became more than just a news story. It became a case study in crisis decision-making, aeronautical engineering, and human performance under extreme stress. Aviation schools around the world began teaching the Olympic Airways Flight 411 incident as part of their curriculum. Flight instructors used Sarah's decisions to teach students about the principles of aerodynamic lift, ground effect, and unconventional problem-solving. The FAA commissioned a comprehensive study on how pilots could be trained to recognize and execute emergency procedures that deviated from standard protocols. Boeing engineers redesigned some of the hydraulic systems in the 747, implementing backup systems that might have prevented the complete hydraulic failure that Sarah's aircraft experienced. The entire aviation industry took lessons from those 93 seconds over Athens. Sarah continued flying for another 10 years after the incident. Every flight she commanded was marked by the same precision, professionalism, and dedication to safety that had defined her career. But she was now something more than just a pilot. She was a symbol of human excellence, a testament to what was possible when training, judgment, and courage combined in perfect proportion. She retired in 2008 at age 62, having logged more than 30,000 flight hours and never again facing an emergency even remotely comparable to that August day in Athens. At her retirement ceremony, fellow pilots, flight attendants, and aviation industry leaders paid tribute to her extraordinary career. But it was a young captain, fresh from earning her wings, who captured the essence of Sarah's legacy. "Captain Mitchell showed us that being a pilot isn't about following rules blindly," the young captain said. "It's about understanding the principles behind those rules so deeply that when the rules stop working, you know what to do." She saved 418 lives, but more than that, she saved the credibility of human judgment in an industry increasingly dominated by automation and standardized procedures. She proved that a brilliant, well-trained human being can think their way through an impossible situation and come out the other side. In 2010, Sarah published her autobiography, Breaking Protocol: How I Saved 418 Lives by Breaking Every Rule in the book. In it, she discussed not just the technical aspects of the emergency, but the psychological, emotional, and moral dimensions of her decisions. She wrote about the weight of command, the knowledge that every decision she made affected 418 people. She wrote about the moment she realized that protocol would kill them all, and the courage it took to choose a different path. She wrote about the aftermath, the investigation, and the vindication of her choices. Most importantly, she wrote about responsibility. The reason I could break those rules was because I understood the principles behind them, she wrote. When you truly understand why a rule exists, you're in a position to recognize when following that rule would do more harm than good. But that understanding comes from years of study, training, and experience. It's not something a pilot arrives at on their first day. It's something that develops over a career of dedication to excellence. Today, Sarah Mitchell lives quietly in rural Colorado with her husband of 35 years. She consults occasionally with aviation companies and the FAA on emergency procedures and pilot training. She teaches seminars on crisis decision-making to pilots from around the world. And every August 9th, she receives emails and letters from people who were on Olympic Airways Flight 411, thanking her for saving their lives. The aircraft itself, the Boeing 747 that carried those 418 people through 93 seconds of impossible aeronautical engineering, was retired in 2005 after decades of service. It was eventually scrapped, but not before being preserved in photographs and technical documentation. That aircraft became a monument to what was possible when human judgment, aeronautical knowledge, and exceptional courage combined in the face of impossible circumstances. Sarah Mitchell never considered herself a hero. She considered herself a pilot who did her job when everything depended on her doing it perfectly. But the aviation community, the passengers she saved, and the millions of people who have studied her case over the decades know the truth. On August 9, 1978, in 93 seconds over Athens, Captain Sarah Mitchell proved that sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is break the rules when breaking the rules is the only way to save lives. Her legacy lives on in every pilot trained to think critically, in every aviation regulation refined to account for extraordinary circumstances, and in the hearts of 418 people who woke up that morning never knowing they were about to witness the most extraordinary display of piloting excellence in modern aviation history.